The first main task now that you've all done the syllabus quiz is to do RRR assessments. We have a template for RRR assessments. In that task, we are going to compare a target article in the literature to a mass replication, or in my case, with the things that I'm doing with my thesis, repeating that target article with a new sample many years later to see some of the differences between these two. Was it successfully replicated? Were we able to reproduce everything? And a good question to ask yourself as you're going through the syllabus and looking at this first task is, why do we need RRRs? Why do we need a replication register reports? And why do we even need to assess any of that? Because many of the articles that you'll do RRR assessments on, the target article was published in a top-tier journal, has been peer-reviewed.
Sorry.
Received many citations. So why do we need to do assessments? Why do we need to do replication? How do you know what kind of thesis you want to do based on what literature? You can even tell me about a project that you've done. Whatever you feel like sharing with others. All of us are pretty much in the same position. We all want to do research. We want to understand research. Perhaps want to implement research. How do we get started? What do we do?
Review.
Sorry?
Literature review.
Literature review. Great. How do we do literature review?
Search up some keywords and
Yeah, let's do an example. For example, what are you doing?
STEM learning.
STEM learning. Okay. Let's punch some keywords in where?
Like for me, I'm doing gender gap in STEM learning. So
Okay.
probably what I would do is to search out gender gap in STEM or gender self-concept and math.
Great. Where do you punch it in?
Gender and math concept.
Yeah, in which website? What platform? Google Scholar. Okay, so we go to Google Scholar where you put your keywords in. What comes out?
All the articles on there. And normally
A lot of things, right?
Yeah.
Typically, how many results do you get for keyword search?
Tens of 1,000.
Yeah, thousands of them, 10,000, sometimes even millions if we're not specific. So big enough, right? And then what do you do?
I will first of all do see what's the most cited source.
Okay, so number of citations.
And I will also do like
Hold on, let's go with this. Why citations? What does this tell you?
that'll give me like a grand picture of what the field was basing most of the research on.
Yeah. So in your field, let's say you see a certain number. How do you determine high, low, good enough, not good enough? Give you some like rules of thumb.
It's like more than 5,000. I would say
5,000.
that's the complete solid paper I could read and see.
Yeah. Which articles tend to have 5,000 citations?
Which article?
Yeah. What type of article?
You mean what type as in?
If we look at all that faculty at HU Psychology is doing, how many of them do you think have articles with more than 5,000 citations?
HKU?
How many articles do I have with more than 5,000 citations?
Probably not.
HU Psychology? Maybe one or two. Maybe one or two, right? What is the typical citation rate for our faculty or like faculty in this domain?
Like the average number of clinicians? I would say not more than 100.
Not more than 100, right? Yeah. Why is this number? What is this number for? What do you think? What does it represent to you?
There's not that many people are using like It's like a long way they do research. I think if they started like review like May, they would probably ignore a lot of like later articles that build up on the original research.
Yeah. Very good. Hope you don't mind that I keep asking you, but I just wanted to clarify like the first thing. I think this is a really good example. So this is something that we all do. Like we go to Google Scholar because that's like the easiest thing. We used to go to Web of Science and all these other corporate and don't need those anymore. Google Scholar covers everything. If you go to Microsoft, right, maybe sometimes. And then we start searching stuff, and then a lot of things come out. And then we need to make a decision with which ones we read. And we make all kinds of split-second decisions, for example, citations. Like, and then we need to make a decision on whether this is credible or not. So we talk about like 100 as being like an average, perhaps, right? Which articles tend to be a lot more than 100? Like 5,000. Which one are those? Yes.
I would say some like assessment, maybe development of certain scales or
Scales for sure, yes. Because everybody wants to use these scales if they become very popular. Right? What else? What other things?
Methods paper,
Methods paper?
recycling smartphone,
Yeah. Okay. Which one did you say?
SPSS process.
Oh, the second
paper, or you
Yeah, no, it is, right. Yeah. And how many times is process being right? Yeah, perfect. So scales and methods, right? So these are get to the 5,000. What else? In your theories, right?
And convincing experimental design.
Convincing.
Because different designs have different strengths of evidence. For example, cross-sectional, longitudinal, large-scale, randomized controlled trials, etc. And in my knowledge, RCT, randomized controlled trial, would be the first choice if we could do that, because it has the strongest evidence. So when we want to cite research to support our theory or research, we basically want research that is most convincing. So we might after the literature review on Google Scholar, we will manually grade how convincing this study for me. So if this research is cross-sectional, okay, just 2 out of 5. But if this research is randomized controlled trial, maybe 4 out of 5. Yeah.
You do 2 out of 5?
Yeah.
3 out of 5, you have these kind of rankings?
Yeah.
Okay, so RCT is 5 out of 5? Cross-sectional is 2 out of 5? Did I get it right?
Yeah, I will read.
Depending on the parameters, but generally it's a category. RCT is higher than cross-sectional.
Of course.
So highest evidence that we have in terms of experimental designs seems to be, if executed well, RCTs, right? Cross-sectional, perhaps not as convincing. Why not as convincing as RCT?
Because cross-sectional research sometimes only review relational relation.
Correlational.
It's quite limited. So every scientist wants causal link for it, etc.
Right. So the issue of causality, right? So cross-sectional tends to emphasize more. So we have a bunch of measures and then we have the correlations. And there's lots of issues with that. If we did a randomized controlled trial, there's a good experimental versus control and random assignment and all that, then we can establish something regarding causality. Yeah, we caused it. Therefore, we can say something about that effect.
Yeah, and
That is great.
Yeah, and another issue might be cross-sectional studies might have many confound variables that be omitted unintentionally by the researchers.
Yes.
But if you make your experimental design good enough, like RCT, etc., theoretically you can control all the potential confounding variables and make your conclusions stronger.
Right. Yes. So we'll discuss all of this. But generally, I think most of the academic community considers RCT, well-conducted RCT, to be the golden standard, which we aspire to, but they're a little bit tricky to do. Some is very costly, some is not possible. People have come up with methods to allow us to do things with cross-sectional, especially like over time, in order to try and draw some conclusions, but still we would prefer if we can establish this velocities. Perfect, thank you very much. I'm curious, how many of you have a star system, like 2 out of 5, 5 out of 5 for different kinds of categories of methods? How many of you have something like that? No. How do you rank different methods? How do you decide which one is higher, which one is lower?
I'm doing development site, so I always prefer longitudinal study. And especially for development psychology, the conceptual data normally comes out as biased. Yes. So those will be probably the least preferred.
Right. What are some keywords that we can punch in order to see if this is like not cross-sectional but over time?
Normally longitudinal study, they will highlight their longitudinal.
We'll bring the title somewhere, right? Yeah. Good. Good. So this seems to be like a criteria for quality in your field. I think generally this is something that we would like to look at, especially if we're looking at development. It's not something that happens in a certain moment. It's something that happens like over time. Right? Yeah. Right. Anything else that comes to mind? We have a list. We even added longitudinal to our keywords, and we still have 50,000 search results. What then do we do?
I think we should limit the criteria for sample size. If we are looking for like a publication, like 50 years ago, you might have a then it is not going to be used that optimized. So what you really want to do is maybe limit it to 5 years, and then you read through the 5 years papers, and then get to know what are people discussing. And perhaps you will find that paper 50 years ago that's like always citing or we can over. Right.
Why would we want to focus on the more recent ones compared to the older ones?
Because like research conducted 50 years ago are like evolving, and there are always new methods. Researchers do trial different kinds of research on different settings, different populations, and we will know the activities research on this very classic topic.
Great. So first, methods change. The way that we do science has really changed. The way that we evaluate science has really changed. Maybe the methods back then we weren't as complex when we did statistics, or in terms of our methodology and procedures, right? So this is outdated. But we also want to know how generalizable, how robust, how much people are implementing this, perhaps different places that this has been conducted. So many reasons to look at recent literature, and we can definitely narrow this to the last 5 years compared to. Great. So we already have some indications of how we search for things, and we have some indications for how we rate certain things, and we all have a different criteria of how we do this. How do we make sure that our criteria, your criteria, and your criteria is the same criteria, so that we can talk to one another? What in the scientific community helps us to make sure that we all live up to the same criteria? But so far, it seems a little bit subjective, right? We have this Google Scholar, we put in whatever keywords we want. We have a bunch of listings, and then we do some things in order for us to help make sense, and then we give it some stars. And then how do we make sure that we're all aligned with this? You want to say something? Yeah.
Peer review.
Peer review. What happens in the peer review?
Well, of course, there's going to be different methods for different people would prefer different methods, but I think the peer review process ensures that at least at a baseline level, the study meets. Because there's several reviewers, right? So at least several reviewers have a consensus that it's a thorough and like valid methodology.
Yeah. Did you have a chance to go through peer review?
No.
No. Who went through some peer review? Got some feedback? You did? Anybody else? You did? How many reviewers usually did you get? Since we're talking about, sorry, three? Three. Two. Three. So between 2 and 3. I would say the maximum that I ever got was 5, and I personally thought that was way too much. Sometimes no reviewers at all, and then the editor, the core editor that has tried again and again to get reviewers, either says, sorry, I have to reject this because I don't have any reviewers for you, or they say, okay, I don't have any reviewers, but this is an important paper, I'll do the review. So they are both the jury and the judge for that specific. So the question of what is a consensus is complicated because, first of all, sometimes we just have one person. Within your 2 to 3, was there a consensus between the peer reviewers about how good your research was? How about your case? Consensus? All 3 agreed?
Yeah.
Said yes. All good? Yeah. What's your impression? Good consensus? Yeah. Okay.
There's some parts.
For some parts.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But you can always say, see, like,
You see differences in what sense?
like, I don't want to go into detail, but like a lot of reviewers, like not a lot, like majority, but 2 of them were thinking like the Feldman literature was thorough and it's a good thing.
Yeah.
But the other one was like, oh, that's too much, you should cut it off.
Okay.
So that's like flipping view.
Right.
Yeah.
Did it sound a little bit subjective to you about how they perceive it? Yeah. So there is some subjectivity in this and something that disagree, right? Yeah. What's your impression?
Because there's a mean reviewer.
Yeah. What do you call this reviewer? Reviewer number 2. You go with number 2, right? Yeah.
And usually, some reviewer will focus on your methodology and critical analysis.
Right.
And then you have to go back to review your analysis and convince them why you should such that.
Right. Yeah.
But usually after the second review, they will like it's better.
Right. Yeah. Hopefully.
Yeah.
Right. Yeah. So this is a really good point. So even if the way that editors work in peer review, just to compare you, when we get this to peer review, is that if this is a good editor, he will try and get diverse opinions and diverse skills. So some people may be focused on literature and they know the literature really well, and others will be focusing on methods. And some of them might be focused on some other aspects. Perhaps they know RCTs really well, so the process, statistical analysis, and they might disagree because somebody might say literature review excellent, but then your methods may be not up to par. And then it becomes really complicated because you need an integrator, and the integrator is usually the editor who needs to decide based on all these opinions what will happen. But very rarely do the editors have like a few comments on similar things. Now, if you got that, this is really terrific, and it means that many have been able to do it. But even this consensus is a little bit tricky. So we're not really sure who the reviewers are in many cases. Perhaps in some platforms, reviewers are identified, but we don't know who they are. But we do know who the editor is, and we do know which journal this is. And we somehow associate this journal or this editor to be competent enough in order to get reviewers. How do you think the reviewers decide what quality is? How do they know what to apply in the peer review? How do you know what you're going to be evaluated on when you submit this to the journal? Just look at other peer reviews, right? Very difficult. Where to find peer reviews? Have you ever seen peer reviews? If you don't know what peer reviews look like, what would you know to aim for when you submit your own manuscript? What did you do before you submitted how did you know how you're going to get evaluated? How did you know what to aim for? How did you know what your evaluation is going to be like?
I think mostly if you're going to learn from previous reviews you have read, Because
Depending on the job, you saw how other reviewers are doing it, and now you're imitating them.
you are likely to have the experience of publishing papers, and then you are likely to be reviewed before.
Yeah.
So you can kind of follow their logic.
Yeah.
And when you see the sample size kind of small, you think, oh, the power. And because they are not so many, there's so generally.
Okay. So what do? We don't, let's say we don't have any experience in submitting papers or being peer reviewers. What can we do in order to know where to aim for? What to do? It's complicated, right? We don't really know, first of all, is there a consensus? What is the consensus on what happened in peer review? But definitely peer review in the academic community, it's very right that peer review is considered the thing that is supposed to standardize all of that. But the problem is that it pulls in different directions, and you really need people who know the work, editors that know what to do, peer reviewers that know how to contribute, perhaps with experience that they've learned from their own submissions that they did peer review, or that they publish papers. But then it's very tricky to know what it is that they're aiming for. So we know that we need to do the best literature review, we need to do the best RCT, we need to do the best statistical reporting, we need to do all. But realistically, we cannot always do the best. And we need to know what is the good enough that would help promote, that would give enough credible evidence. And we need to know how to fit your star system so that we don't fall into 2, that we can get to 4 and 5, right? So that if you're a reviewer, you won't reject us, right? So a lot of very difficult questions. And I think as a PhD student, I very rarely reflected on these things. Only when we submitted to the journal and then I got this very long list of things that I did wrong, did I realize I actually did not know what to aim for. How did I learn? I looked at what was published and I tried to imitate that. There's a little bit of a problem with that. What's the danger of just looking at the literature and then aiming for that? What's missing? So you need to ask yourself, as you're doing your thesis, what are your standards? What are you aiming for? If you aim to stay in academia, if you care about doing a PhD, and then afterwards perhaps having a chance to stay here, then you want to know, what do I need to do in order to submit a paper that would pass peer review? If you're a practitioner, you read a paper, you want to know, what happened in this peer review? Can I trust this? Now, should I implement this on real people or not? Right? The more I ask questions, the more I realize that people don't have answers. I don't know why you don't want to talk about this, but I don't just ask you. I ask faculty as well. When I give workshops, when I talk to my colleagues, I ask them, what are your standards? How do you evaluate these things? Can you please show me a paper or something in order to help me understand how you evaluate papers? Often, I don't get any real objective response. Some people have their own intuitions, based on my experience, this is what I've learned. I've seen that in a peer reviewer, I've seen that editor, I've seen that in the literature. And then you ask yourself, but based on what? What is that? Now, if we, here in this room, postgraduate class, don't know how to answer this, what do you think happens to the person in the street who is trying to make sense of whether to take a vaccine, to wear a mask or not? Especially when it becomes very confusing because you have different voices coming from different directions and suddenly scientists perhaps don't agree on everything. As the government implements things that are not completely in line with scientists, what do you do? What do you follow? Do you implement this on yourself? Do you do this with your kids? With your family? So I feel like we should have some kind of criteria for us to be able to evaluate this, so that when we go to the field, when we talk to our families, when we see the people in the street, we can tell them, this is what we think is credible. So today, what we aim to do together is to get a feel for you to think about the process of what is credible to you. And the way that we're going to do this is by a hackathon. What usually happens in a hackathon? I'll tell you from my experience, I did not know what a hackathon is during my PhD or during my postdoc. My first meeting with a hackathon was in the Society for Improvement of Psychological Science. I was completely amazed. But I came to a conference expecting a lot of talks, and instead of the talks, we all sat around in a table, around the table, opened our laptops, and started working on problems. And the problem could be as simple as, how do you establish credibility? How do you know what is real and what is not? So somebody can ask a question, and this could be an undergraduate, it could be somebody from the field, a practitioner, coming in and saying, there's something that I don't understand. I've asked many people and I don't have a reply to this. Can you please help me establish X? And then we think, oh, this is really interesting. Let's all sit together, dump our thoughts into one manuscript, and then see what comes out. Oh my God, the mess, the chaos that ensues with a bunch of researchers from different backgrounds, from different parts of the world, sitting down together and trying to put this in writing. But what comes afterwards is a really fascinating process, because slowly from the chaos emerges a structure where we can debate things. Not me putting you on the spot now in class, how are you doing your thesis, what happens when you submit and all this. But you have some time, you sit together with people in a room, you contemplate, you write things down, you see what others are doing, this kind of flags things, raises things, triggers things in your mind. You're like, oh, this reminds me, this is actually what I do. And then you write that. And the way that we usually do this is we work collaboratively. So sometimes some people like to work individually, and that's completely okay, but some people like to brainstorm this in 2 or 3. And then they brainstorm, and then somebody punches in as people brainstorm. So it's really interesting to see this process. It takes a while for you to get used to it, but I really want us to try this together. So even if you don't have a clear idea, when I ask these questions, you don't have answers. I do want you to try and pitch in from your own process, from your own experience of what it is that you went through. And maybe, hopefully, at the end of this session, we'll be able to have criteria of our class, of what we think is credible, how we look at things. Now, I was debating with myself of whether I should establish a baseline, because I want to show you what that looks like. But I really don't want you to follow my very biased theory. There are certain things that I emphasize, especially open science. But it could be that you have other criteria, which is better than mine. So I was debating, should I put some examples in for myself so that you'll know what we're talking about? Or should I just leave it out because I'm afraid that this will bias it? But for this session, I decided to give you some examples because I know it's difficult to think about this. And I know that some of you don't have a lot of experience. So I wrote some examples for myself, but you don't have to accept them. And typically what we do in this kind of process is that we have different stages. In the first stage, we just dump everything that we can. So we have like 20, 30 minutes where it's just like massive dumping into as much as possible to make the document as extensive as possible. And then we have a process of cleaning up or verifying, where we stop, we don't add any more content, we just go over the content that's there. And then we try to confirm it, or we try to have some notes, or we try to clarify what everything means. In the final test, it's possible in this hackathon, but not always in every other hackathon, we try to implement this on something practical. So for example, in this hackathon, we want to try and establish a criteria. We will try and look at whether this criteria, how this criteria behave when I give you a target article. So I will give you a target article, and I would ask you to assess the target article based on the criteria that we all create. Okay, terrific. So we have half an hour. Remember, don't overthink this. Whatever comes to your mind, just do a new row and dump it, okay? If you get stuck, discuss this with somebody else and then dump it. Just dump as much as possible in the next half an hour, so we'll have as much criteria as possible, and then we'll make sense of that, okay? So think, what is credibility to you? For sure. Learn from others, learn from me, learn from yourself, whatever triggers your creative mindset. Add as much as possible. If you see somebody wrote something and you want it clarified, add another row to clarify it. If you want to add a note, add a note. Hackathons is all of us together helping each other. Okay? Any other questions like that? Definitely use whatever resource is possible. Don't overthink. Just write it down. As you're looking at this, think for yourself in your thesis, in whatever you're doing your research, what is credible? What kind of assumptions are you making when you look at an article, when you do your Google Scholar? Okay? Go for it. You're doing a great job in writing a lot of entries. Don't forget, there's also a column about weight. So what is the weight? None, low, medium, high? No, good. Think about this first dumping, then adding the weight. But also think about this. How much do you emphasize this? The H factor of the authors, is this important? If you're running out of ideas, don't forget we have the RRR assessment page that you can also look at the template. You can use that template in order to have some ideas. You can look at the Google Doc for evaluating credibility that we started. If you're starting to run out of ideas, it's completely okay to go to somebody else's idea and then put a weight on that. So help them out. So it's collaborative. Everybody's helping each other. In addition, it's completely okay to go to somebody else's
And change it.
instead of changing it, adding a note saying what needs to be clarified. If you see a way to improve it without changing it, do that. Help out. One more note I want to ask you to think about is that when you write something like empirical evidence, it's a great title. I just don't know exactly what this means. So break it down. Tell me what empirical evidence means. Contrasting findings from the literature. What does contrasting mean and why is it important? Why is this a factor? How do you know if it's contrasting or not, right? So you can say, for example, empirical finding is like, there's a meta-analysis on this. Or you can say something like, I expect this body of literature, or I expect something, but try and make this quantifiable as much as possible so that it's less subjective and more objective. So if you see somebody else's criteria that seems too subjective, write the question. If you find a way to improve this, add another row underneath, and then add something in order to try and do this better. So it's completely okay to copy paste a row, right? And then just add a clarification or add some metrics or add some objectivity to make that better. So it's completely okay that you take somebody else's ideas and add something on top of that. It's not about novelty. It's not about who does something new. It's more about us working together in order to improve this. Last 10 minutes, so try and do this as much as possible to make this as complete as possible. Weights, clarifying, and finalizing the items. Thank you so much. Let's put laptops down and maybe shift the gaze up from the laptop just so I can see all of you. Thanks for taking part in your first hackathon. I think it's amazing to kind of stare at the Google Sheet and see everybody working together. Can you imagine being in a conference with 200 people working together on the same thing? There's something amazing in the power of collaboration. And I don't know how you came into this task, whether you thought something will come out of that, but I'm pretty impressed looking at, for half an hour, what we achieved with this Google Sheet is already very impressive. And it builds foundations that we can improve on later. So we can take this and then expand this and then create this into something that might actually be a manuscript submission. Many of you think, but it's not an experiment, but it's not study. I didn't have anybody come into the lab who's going to be interested in this. But if you think about the beginning of the session, which are the articles that get cited the most? Which ones are those? Methods.
something that clarifies process. So if you go to AMPPS, do you know that journal? Advanced Methods and Practices in Psychological Science, very new, only 4 or 5 years, right? But already within the impact factor game, jumped into 15, and I think it's gonna keep jumping because people cite methods. People really care about that. And AMPPS, if you're not familiar, just issue the call that all of you can address. You want a publication in a high impact factor journal, this is your chance. Because now they're looking for methods, they're looking for clarifications, they're looking for stuff like that. So if what you did here today, or in any of the other hackathons that we're going to do, is interesting for you, and you want to lead this to publication, this is a good chance for you to do that. Then all of us can be co-authors. You can lead this to a submission. So it just means activating people to work together, scheduling a classroom, bringing people in, having clear instructions, and then seeing what comes out of the process. From your perspective, can I hear just like very briefly, what are your impressions? You like this idea, not like this idea? How many of you enjoy this as a process? Little bit? Yeah, okay, good, yeah. How many of you would like to do more hackathons in the future? Some of you? Little bit, yeah, no, it's completely okay, yeah. This is, we'll train this, we'll see more options of doing this. Hopefully the other ones will not be as chaotic, they'll be a little bit more structured, and they will lead into real submissions. So for example, 2 of the hackathons that we'll have are actually hackathons that I regularly give in other universities, where in the first hackathon, we together in 3 hours write a pre-registration. Then during the week, I collect the data. And then in the next one, we all analyze this together and write the manuscript. So after 2 sessions, you can have a manuscript submission, which is amazing. In one of the sessions that I ran in Sweden, it's already published. In the other one, now somebody is writing this up. So it's already ready. Somebody just making this ready for journal submission, okay? So you can do a lot within 2 sessions of 3 hours. You can do a lot just to get people started working on something. So even if you're not super enthusiastic about this, I'm hoping that you can gain some insights from that in order to get you to think about what is the process in your thesis, okay? Now we're going to do something even more complicated. I'm going to show you an article that you've never read. It's not a short article, it's in psychological science, and I want all of us to analyze this together based on this criteria. Why is this important? Because we need to pre-test this on ourselves. We wrote a bunch of things, but we don't know whether this can really be applied. So the only way for us to know this is to confront ourselves with the situation of actually implementing this on an article. And we need to do this under time pressure. Why? Because we have 50,000 results in Google Scholar. We don't have time to go over all of those. So within 20 minutes, we all need to be able to go through this article and code as much as possible about whether this is trustworthy, credible, or not. This is our article. So if you go back to the slides, our article is mgto.org/target article. It's Hart and Albarracin, 2011, learning about what others were doing, verb aspect and attributions of mundane and criminal intent. I don't want you to understand the theory. I don't want you to read into this too much. It's not about you going and understanding every aspect. It's about making quick judgments based on the Google Sheet that you just completed with your classmates, okay? So if you go to this article, it's this one over here, right? It's about 4 pages long. So very briefly, skim through the article as fast as you can and try to code this in the actual Google Sheet. So if you go back to the Google Sheet, you see this F column. Go through this, choose where you want to start. Each one of you can start from different directions. If you care about methods, go to methods. If you care about results, go to results. But move as fast as possible from the article to the coding. Try and code as much as you can within 20 minutes, okay? And then we'll check ourselves again to see where we are. Is this clear? Yes?
It's right, yes or no.
Good question. Write whatever you think is appropriate. If you think it's yes or no, yeah. If you think there's more detail, write more details. Yes, please. And then write who you are. So you are the verifier, okay? So after you've written something, write who you are. If it's yes, no, terrific. If you feel like more detail, add more detail. I feel like we should also add a column of, oh, there is, verifier notes. So if it's more than yes, no, you can add notes. All good? Do you understand the task? All right, let's begin, 20 minutes. Actually, I feel like experiment 1 is simple enough. Experiment 1, focus only on experiment 1, not the other 2 experiments. So only experiment 1. As you're working on this, try and make your own assessment. Would you consider this article to be credible or not? Because I'll ask you to vote on this at the end of this exercise. Okay? Hope that was an interesting experience for you. Let's move away from the keyboard for a second and look at me just so I can get your confirmation. Yeah. Interesting experience, right? At the beginning, we just dumped everything, wasn't very organized, but now we have to implement this on something. So we get a different perspective of how applicable is this? Were we clear enough? What does this actually mean? Do we value this aspect or not? It's really interesting as you walk through this, first to see how much is missing, right? It's a very brief article, but it already has a lot of information, and you were able to, in 20 minutes, collaboratively code many aspects of that article. So maybe for an individual to go through this whole thing might take a very long time, but collaboratively, we can move through a lot of articles fairly fast. Now let's go through very briefly what it is that you wrote. So it's published in Psychological Science. Somebody was very quick to even look at the impact factor and the top factor for this. So 10 is high impact factor in HKU. This is rated as used to be rated as a 4-star, so like a very high rated journal. We all want to publish in Psychological Science. So considered to be reputable and no conflicts of interest stated. We don't know, right? Highly reputable, seems to be doing fairly well. The only problem here is that I think that this was noted for what Psychological Science is today, but in terms of top factor in 2011, that did not exist. How Psychological Science did in 2011? Not very well, because, for example, we see no data sharing, no code sharing, no pre-registration, right? But this is 2011. So just need to be a little bit careful about this. Is the theory likely? So what is the theory? Just by changing the verb, we can affect all sorts of cognitive mental states, right? So somebody said plausible. Think about what you think about that. Recency of citation, pretty good. Empirical evidence to support, yes, but a little bit dated, okay. Citations are a little bit general, yes. Not a lot of information in terms of the methods, I think, but let's see what you wrote. Is the design clear? Yes. Not an RCT in the traditional sense, I guess. Sampling bias, maybe. Not mention, no. Not specify, no. So missing a lot of details, right? A lot of things that we don't know. If we go to the results, we have a Cohen's d. You were asking about the Cohen's d. What was the Cohen's d? We need a row for this. Cohen's d of about 1, right? Yes, there is confidence intervals. Was there? I don't remember. Was it reported? I don't see the confidence intervals. Let's see what else. P-value is very low, right? So we have a p-value that's very low over here. Yeah, 2 participants were lost. We don't really know and understand why. No figures, no graphs, not a lot of other things. All right. So what do we have here? We have a very reputable journal, a very high impact factor, at least doing well today in terms of the top ranking, top factor, and a bunch of other factors in terms of this being fairly brief, not a lot of transparency, but very large effect size. right? So suppose that you now need to make a decision of whether to base the next 4 years of your thesis on this or not. If you're a practitioner, whether to implement this kind of intervention on your patients. How many of you would consider this to be highly credible? Raise your hand. How many of you would consider this to be medium credible? Raise your hand. Some of you? Okay, good, interesting. How many of you would say low credibility? Good, yeah, okay. How many of you would say no credibility? Should not avoid at all costs? Okay, very good. When we come back, I'll tell you the story of why I chose this one, and we'll talk a little bit about what happened and why we do RRRs and why we do assessments. But I'll give you a 5-minute break just so you can refresh a little bit. I know this was an exhausting task. 5 minutes, come back, and we'll finish the session. Good. So the main readings, if you ever want to follow up on this, hey, woo. Okay, yeah. So the main readings, if you want to follow up on this very unique, specific case study, these are the main readings. We have the target article, which is Hart and Alboresin. There's a multi-lab registered replication report published in 2016 in Perspectives of Psychological Science. Already preempting the result here, why scientists should not replicate their own work by Neuroskeptic. And then we have the editorial by Alex here that wrote the introduction to this registered replication report, the official reply from Hart to the replication report, and then the coverage that happened on APS. So just so we understand this effect, and I think in psychological science, especially in 2011, there were quite a few articles that sounded like this. I know because I was doing my PhD at the time. So this was kind of common and mind-blowing because we really wanted to know effects like that. And for example, in judgment decision-making, we study a lot of nudging. I don't know if you've heard of nudge, but these are very simple interventions that are supposed to result in very large effects. So that, for example, if we want people to behave better on the road, then we can add all sorts of ways to help them do this. Like, for example, adding lights on the side in order to make this more easy, or some nudge, some hint to make them drive slower, like doing bumps, reminders, and all sorts of stuff like that. Here we have just, you read this already, I'm just going to go over this very briefly. We tested whether the attribution of intentionality to a person is influenced by whether the person's behaviors are described as what the person was doing or what the person did. Imperfective versus perfective aspect. So just by changing the way the things were described, this would impact the way that people will attribute intentionality to that person. Okay? In 3 experiments, participants who read what the person was doing showed enhanced accessibility of intention-related concepts and attributed more intentionality to the person compared with participants who read what the person did. So was doing versus did, right? Here's what we have in study 1. How many participants do we have? 54 in Introduction to Psychology. They read 15 different descriptions of Keith. The manipulation was like this. Keith prepared or was preparing dinner for some friends. Keith read or was reading. Keith made or was making small talk with a neighbor. Right? Study 1, dependent measure. How to do this? So for example, either a word related to intentions, try, aim, goal, determination, or if you can see it's the same structure, T-R-Y, T-O-Y. So basically you have T-M-Y. So we give people just these blanks and we ask them, please fill in the letter that seems right to you. So they were claiming that if you use a certain type, so for example, prepared, people will be more likely to give the answer try than give the answer toy to this kind of prompt. Do you understand the methods? Very interesting methods, kind of like innovative and funky, right? Study 1 results. As predicted, participants in the imperfective aspect condition completed more word stems with the words denoting intentions, so these ones, than participants in the perfective aspect. And then we have the raw statistics. We have the F, which is quite large. You can see the p-value is quite low, and the effect size is 1. Any questions about this that you want to ask? Something is not clear about this explanation? So what do we see here? We see a very interesting kind of change in the manipulation, a very slight one from Keith prepared to was preparing. And then we see an implicit way of accessing people's psyche, cognitive mental states, by having them fill in words, letters to fill in a word. And then we have the results. What do you know about this effect size? Effect size of Cohen's d of 1. What is that? What does that tell you? Extremely large. How do you know this?
258 is corresponding values for small, medium, and
258 what? 0.2, 0.5, 0.8. Yeah. Where is this from?
Cohen.
From Cohen.
Yeah.
Actually, Cohen said this when he came out with his standards. Very good.
Yeah.
When he came out with this, actually Cohen, who didn't really care about social psychology in these verbs back then in the 80s, said, let me just tell you, since you asked me, a low one is 0.2, a medium one is 0.5, and a large one is 0.8. A Cohen's d of 1 is above what he considered to be high. So very correct, right? So I want you to ask yourself, and I think I heard a little bit of a discussion here. When I see a Cohen's d of 1 over a very slight manipulation of changing a verb and a very indirect, implicit way of accessing somebody's mental state, does a Cohen's d of 1 make sense to me or not, right? Now, if I want to know what is a Cohen's d of 1, and I don't know because I haven't read Cohen, you have effect size guide that was created here at HKU, which we will be submitting to the upcoming AMPPS that I told you about, which is this call. So we talked to the editor and we said, we at HKU developed this effect size guide with students like you. MPhil were here, did their undergraduates with me, then continued to do their MPhil. Now one of them is at COHK and one of them is in Vienna. So we together did this effect size guide. If we just click on this, you'll see that it's very elaborate, and we did this collaboratively. So there's a bunch of us at the beginning here at HKU, and then we went on Twitter and invited others. So you can see Chinyu here and Shokit, and then followed by all the rest, and then me trailing at the back. We have a preprint that has been up there for a while and is by far the most used resource that we ever have. Together, we add a bunch of things. So we wrote like an abstract, and you can see that people occasionally like come and update and have a discussion, just like we did here. So alone to write this guide would be very exhausting for me. But with this power group, we were able to do some amazing things. One of the nice things that we have is that we have a section called benchmark. And here we have all the effects, the benchmarks, including Cohen's. So you can see over here 0.2, 0.5, 0.8, which is exactly what you said. But this was not specific to social psychology. So actually we want to know in social psychology, what is a typical effect size? So for that, we have this paper from 2017. And actually, the effects are a little bit lower than Cohen's. So in social psychology, the effect sizes are 0.65 is large, 0.36 is medium. And you can click on this link in order to see the effects. If you're not sure how to interpret an eta square or a Cohen's Q, so we added a bunch of citations so you can do that. So you can go over there. If you also want to know how to calculate this for a t-test, you can see we added a bunch of things, including how to calculate this, and of course the R code that you can copy paste into your R. So effect size guide is supposed to just give you everything that you need about effect sizes, written by people like you at HKU, students, MPhil, that are continuing in academia. So hopefully we'll get this published next year. In AMPPS remains to be seen. This is how Hart and Albarracin communicated their findings, right? So this reveals that the way that the statement is phrased and specifically how the verbs are used affects our memory of an event being described and may also influence our behavior. What can we see from this statement? Already there's a little bit of going beyond what was in the study, right? So we need to be very careful when we look at media press, especially if it was written by the actual authors. Are they perhaps overclaiming? And then this is what they wrote. The authors note, and this is especially for you guys, that these findings may be relevant to behavioral therapy. They suggest that decreasing the frequency of unhealthy behaviors might be facilitated by discussing these behaviors in terms of what I did. In contrast, increasing the frequency of healthy behaviors might be facilitated by discussing these behaviors in terms of what I was doing. So maybe less of CBT, maybe less of positive psychology. We can do something like changing the verb. So a bunch of people went to Perspective of Psychological Science when Alex was there, and he was inviting registered reports for replications. And this is what he wrote. Prior to data collection, each of the 12 participating labs, each one of them, predicted the effect that they would observe. 8 expected an effect size of at least Cohen's d of 0.55 in the same direction as the original. So very high trust in this, right? The individual results and the result of the planned meta-analysis surprised all 12 of the team, right? Those 2 studies found an effect and 2 others did not produce a significant effect based on the literature before the RRR. So we don't really know why they had such high confidence in this, but I can tell you as a PhD student from 2011, when I saw something coming on in psychological science by reputable authors with this kind of effect size, I'm like, let's just go and do this, let's just implement this as fast as possible. This is what the registered report, the replication, found. This is the original experiment. This is like experiment 3. Effect size is even higher, Cohen's d of 1.2. This is one of the replications that was done online. You can see it going in the opposite direction, and actually this is a significant effect. You can see the confidence intervals do not overlap with the null. So you can see the null here is this line in the middle. We can see the original experiment on the right side. We can see the online sample on the left. You can see it goes in the opposite direction in terms of imperfective and perfective. And then you can see that when we run the different labs, and all of them were very confident in this, you see them going in all sorts of directions, but actually 2 of them were significant in the other direction. And most of them were overlapping with the null. Overlapping with the null, it means that the confidence interval included the null, okay? How do we make sense of this? We meta-analyze this. And then what we see here at the end is meta-analytic effect for the laboratory replications only, so only these ones without the online one. You can see there's a diamond. And the diamond is actually the confidence intervals. The center of the diamond is the effect size, which is minus 0.24. And then we can actually see that it overlaps with the null. So 0 is included within the confidence intervals. This is very, very different. This diamond is very different from what was in the original. Why are some of the confidence intervals so wide, like here, and some of them are so narrow? Because this is the noise. If you have a very small sample, there's a lot of noise, so the confidence intervals are very wide. If you have a large sample, like they did in the online study, then it narrows down. What other indicators do I have from this plot to know what was the sample size? I can see the size of the rectangle. So you can see the rectangle here is larger than the rectangle here, which is very, very small. So when you read the meta-analysis, now you can make sense of what this means. You have the null in the middle, you have the confidence intervals, you have the rectangle that tells you the sample size, and then you can see the differences between the two conditions on the left and a meta-analytic effect aggregating everything together at the end. So the conclusion here is the meta-analytic effect includes the null, therefore no support for this effect. If there's anything in there, it almost seems to go in the opposite direction. This is for 1DV, intentionality. This is for imagery. And here you can see same kind of story. So the effects originally was 0.92, and then you can see overlaps with the null. This is for intention attribution, also about the same. The effects actually, the meta-analytic effect is exactly 0, right? And you can see it's very, very narrow. So it's an aggregation of all of this. So why did I choose this case study? I wanted to highlight some of the challenges in replications. So Hart did a response to this replication, this failed replication. They go to the authors and they say, what do you have to say about this? Unlocking past emotion, verb use affects mood and happiness. In here, I'll summarize this for you. He said, it didn't work for you. I don't know what you did over there. It always works for me. I've done this many, many times. Therefore, it works. Not only this, but I've also published this as my own replication. So there's a published replication. Now, I don't know if you see this, but something is very odd about this PDF. Something is written here. What is written here? Why was this retracted? Which is very interesting. Because once he wrote this, the editor went to him and said, oh, you're saying that you replicated this. Please share your data with us, because the data was not originally shared. And Rolf here, who I think is the Dean for Psychology in Erasmus University in the Netherlands, wrote in his blog in 2017 that he just wanted to have a very quick look at the data. So you can go and read this in his blog. And what he did this is after he opened the data, I just sorted the file by verbal responses. So many people just like wrote a bunch of things about how they respond to the stimuli. And what he noticed immediately was that if you look at this, some of the rows replicate. So some of the rows have more than one, and only in the direction of the effect that worked. So somebody somehow duplicated these, right? This is a very serious problem. And this is the reason why the other response was retracted, and the actual paper that did the so-called replication. This is the summary. A study examining whether the verb tense you use to describe positive influences your current mood will be retracted after a university investigation found the data has been manipulated. Who did the manipulation? We asked William Hart, who did the manipulation? Who did he say? By whom is the question? The notice cites an unnamed graduate student as the source of the manipulation, and says the only author, William Hart, was unaware of what had occurred. So this is something for us to think about as students when we work with an advisor. I don't know who is to blame here. I don't know who this person is. I don't know why they're unnamed, but I consider fraud to be something very, very serious. Somebody should have named this person, and maybe somebody should have done something about that, right? But just to say some unnamed graduate student is a very, very big problem, right? And it could be that when we participate in a lab, we need to consider what is our role in that lab. When we participate with other people who we don't know what they're doing and how they're acting, how does this reflect back on us? This is why I like transparency. It also helps protect you. So when you're fully transparent about everything that you do, nobody can come and say, this is you. Somebody else is to blame, right? This is the retraction. A former graduate student in Williams Hart lab altered the data in a strategic way. The investigation found that William Hart was unaware of the article was published and the data has been manipulated. Now, beyond this very strange, bizarre case of there was a problem, should have been retracted, we don't understand, the paper from 2011, if you opened it, is still there, despite the very large mass replication of people that have failed to replicate this. And the question is, should we have really spent all that money and time in order to conduct that replication, or were there warning signs, like the things that we wrote in our Google Sheet? Maybe there's a way of assessing credibility that doesn't require having so many labs, spending so much money and time to replicate these kinds of things. So this is not a hypothetical kind of exercise. This is very important for you to decide what you want to spend the next 4 years of your life on. Or perhaps if you're going to academia, further down the road. If you're a practitioner, what do you want to waste the time that you have, the very precious time that you have, with your patients on? Perhaps there's also the possibility of harm. I like this summary by Richard Morey on Medium about this heart retraction. I'll let you read this whole thing if you want later on, but I'll just summarize this. The basic problem here is not the result in terms of the duplication or what happened with the data fraud, but the basic implausibility of the methods combined with the results. So we should have been able to see this just by looking at the article, because it's a very, very small sample. It's a very, very slight manipulation. It's a very, very implicit way of assessing these kinds of things with an extremely large effect size. This is implausible. We trust peer reviewers to do their job, but they've missed this. Not only this, if you go to Psychological Science in 2011, there's a bunch of these things, right and left. Unfortunately, because we told them to, practitioners go and they implement this, right? Causing a lot of harm or preventing a lot of good in the time that they have with their patients. So presumably, the graduate student did not force Hart to measure memory using a 4 lexical decision trials per condition. If someone claims to have hit a bullseye from 500 meters in a hurricane force winds with a pea shooter, then the claims years later that a previously unmentioned assistant faked the bullseye, you've got a right to look them and ask questions, right? So the whole thing seems very, very implausible. So when you do research in your lab with your advisor, in your thesis, ask yourself, is this credible? Does this make sense? Is this plausible? The only way to do this is code as much as possible. Think about all of these things that we thought about today. What makes a study credible? We have to ask ourselves that. We can't just go to the advisor and say, tell me what the truth is. I did not ask these questions in my PhD. I really want you to, okay? So we'll wrap this up here now. We'll do the peer community and register reports afterwards. So we have the syllabus in our schedule. You've completed the Qualtrics. There is this, don't want to see this, yeah. Complete the contract. And then if you want to know how to do RRR assessments, we have 2 videos that we prepared for the undergraduate class. I'll make this a bit bigger. Video 1 and video 2. On how to do RRR assessments, how to use the template, and then as you're working on the team contract, try and assign roles, try and define things as detailed as possible. And then I will come back to this Google Sheet that we did here in order to try and build this together into your RRR assessment. You can use this in any way that you want. RRR assessment is for you. This is an exercise for you. I would like to see how you think about my work, how you think about the target article that we replicated, but I want you to use this exercise in order to think, what is assessment to you? What is credible to you? And then from that, learn on how you will do your replication assigned to you with your group this week by Christy. Okay? If you have any questions, we're available on Slack. Please write this and tag me. I will be happy to answer any questions. If you want to follow up on this, if this kind of stuff is interesting to you, if you want to answer the call from AMPPS in order to submit something like we are doing with the effect side, if you want to take the Google Sheet and work with this further, I'm very open to that. Contact me, let me know, and we'll see how to make that happen. Any questions before we go? Great. Thank you for taking part in the first hackathon. Hope for more fun later.